Today we are going to do a brisket, and because I do live in Texas and I haven't done one specifically for this, I wanted to create a video showing you how to actually do a Texas crutch style brisket. Alright, so you're going to need a couple of things. This is going to be a video that takes you step by step on from selecting your brisket to prepping it, to putting it in the smoker, to maintaining it while it's in the smoker, and then wrapping it afterwards, and then at the very end cutting it. Just starting off on selecting briskets and cooking them and smoking them, I would suggest you watch the video in its entirety, because I will give you some tips that I've picked up along the way. I've been doing this for a couple of years now, and there's certain things that I've picked up that can help you guys select the right briskets, and at the same time cook them at the right temperature and cook them at the right method, so that you guys get a nice juicy brisket. Alright, so the very first step, it's a very crucial step that you need to know whenever you're selecting a brisket from your market or from wherever you're going to purchase it from. There are certain things that you want to look for in a brisket that you can select. If you're more of an expert on this, you can pretty much purchase any brisket and make it get it to the point that you want it. But if you're somebody who's just starting off, some key points that I can point out, some suggestions are as follows. The first thing you want to do is, when you're looking for a brisket at your market or wherever you're going to purchase it, you want to look for a brisket that when you pick it up and you grab it, it has some bend to it. All right. Why is this important? It's important because if you get a brisket and you pick it up and it doesn't bend at all, that's going to tell you that there's a lot of fat in here, a lot of fat that will not end up going into the cook. All right, a lot of this hard fat that is not going to actually melt into the cook. So when you look at a brisket, especially when you're getting it from your market, you got to make sure that you look at it, and that when you feel it, there's a lot of, even though there is some fat, you can notice there's a lot of fat around here. The fat cap is what it's called. But if you look at it, it's very pliable, which means I can move it around, which means there is fat, but it's not that hard fat that's not going to render. Okay, so that's tip number one. Make sure you grab a brisket at the market. When you're looking at them, you can give it the bend test, which is just flap it back and forth. If it bends pretty easily, then you're good to go. So that's tip number one. Look for a brisket that is pliable like this, okay? That gives you a more tender cut of meat. Now, typically there's three types of grades on your brisket, and all of it has to do with the marbling of the brisket itself. Now, when I first heard the word marbling, I was like, what is that? I don't understand what that means. In a nutshell, marbling means more fat within the fibers. I usually purchase briskets, your very basic brisket, which is your lower end briskets, the cheapest briskets you can find, because when you do a low and slow cooking method, it doesn't necessarily matter the grade of brisket that you purchase. It's because you cook it low and slow, it will end up coming out nice and soft and tender. This is one of the very rare times that I actually went out and I actually splurged. I paid about an extra $1.25 a pound more, and I ended up buying myself a US prime beef brisket. And what essentially that means is that whenever they look at a brisket, they look at the marbling, and don't get too confused of what marbling means. All it means is the marbling is they're looking at the fat. So this is a fat cap. That's not what they're looking at. What they're looking at is actually within the fibers itself. You're going to have brisket and you're going to have fibers that go across. Whenever they say look at this marbling, what they're basically looking at is look at the fat within the fibers, like right there. There's a fiber and then there's a fat within it. Believe it or not, this is what makes your brisket more tender, more juicy, is the fat that's trapped within the fibers. So whenever you're looking for a brisket and they talk about marbling, that's exactly what they're talking about. Why is that important? It's important because all this fat on top, on the outside of the brisket, whenever you're cooking it, it will go in, it will seep in a little bit, but the fat that's trapped within the fibers is actually gonna make that area that much more tender. So that is actually why people pay a little bit extra for your brisket, is because you get more fat within the fibers. So that's two. Again, not really necessary when you're doing low and slow, because when you do low and slow at 220, your brisket will come out very tender. But if you want to give that extra added bonus to it, and you can afford it, pay the extra $1.25 a pound, and you can get yourself a brisket that is one of the higher end briskets that you can buy here in the States. So once you found your brisket, once you see it's pliable, once you're happy with it, you want to make sure that there's this really hard part right here. There's a big hard fat part that all briskets come with. You want to try to find one that has not as much fat here, because this is non-rendable fat, which means this fat's just here. It's not going to end up going into your brisket and giving it any type of extra taste to it. When you bring this out, this is a type of fat that you cut out, and it still looks like it's like almost like a jello style or a jello type. So the less you have here, the less you're going to pay for that fat that you're not going to end up getting. But you do want a brisket that has a fat cap. This fat cap is actually going to help you get a nice and tender brisket. The other thing that you want to look for whenever you're looking for a brisket is you want to look for a brisket that has a very a good ratio from your point to your flat. Okay, so what that means is that you don't want to have a real thick brisket on this end and a real thin brisket piece on this end, because what's going to happen is during your cook, this end is going to be done way faster than this end, which means that if you wait until this is done, this side of the brisket, which is your lean part, is going to be very dry. So whenever I look for a brisket, I try to look for one that's very even from one side to the next, especially this part. I don't want this part to taper off at the end. I don't want it to look like a pencil point here, because if that happens, that means that this part is going to be very dry by the time I get all of my brisket cooked. So when you look at a brisket this way, at this angle, see if you can get a brisket that doesn't taper off too much. There is going to be some tapering, but not too much to a point where it's going to be very thin over here, and it's going to create a drier brisket. So that's another tip that I've found that is real good. Why? Because if I look at this brisket, that means that when I cook it, yes, this is going to be done a little bit sooner, but not 2, 3, 4 hours before this one, compared to if I were to buy a very thick side here, taper it down, and this side is going to be it's going to be done a lot sooner. It's going to start to dry out on you. Okay? So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pull this brisket out, and I'm going to season it, and I'm going to show you the methods that I have, or the tips that I had to season this, so that we can go on to the next step. One of the things that I did end up purchasing was this deep tray looking thing. I like this because once I cut my brisket, once I cut it out of the bag, I can stick it in here and I can start seasoning it in here, and everything kind of stays in here. Before, I used to season it outside and then put it in, and I would make a big mess around the counter. This way, most of the seasoning stays in here, and it minimizes the mess. So if you can find something where you can actually season your brisket, it'll make you clean up a lot easier. And also what I do is, once it's seasoned in here, I just cover it up and I put it in the refrigerator. That's another quick step. You don't have to put it anywhere else. You don't have to transfer it. It's already here. You just stick it in. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the brisket out of the packaging, and then we're going to go ahead and start seasoning it. So now I have my brisket out of the packaging. All I did is I took the package, the wrapping off, and I threw it in the trash. The next thing you want to do is you want to season it. Now, if you're a traditionalist, most people say, you know, all you need is salt and pepper, which is fine. I've tasted briskets, salt and pepper, no problem. What I like is, what I did is I found a seasoning that I like. Now, for me, something that always worked really well for me, and I don't know if this is in any other state, but I know it for sure it's here in Texas. I like to purchase my rub from Rudy's Rub. From Rudy's. I like to purchase my rub from Rudy's Rub. This is a restaurant that sells not only briskets, but they also sell their seasoning as well. And Rudy's, if you're watching this video, hit me up with some seasonings. I'm promoting your your restaurant all the time without any reason to, but only because I love it. So if you appreciate it, hook it up, right, with some free seasonings or something. But this one's not actually too bad. This one's will run you about $5, $6 at Rudy's, and it's a pretty big one, a pretty big seasoning bottle. I can probably get about 4 or 5 briskets out of this, depending on how spicy I want it. the seasoning, really, to me, it's up to you. If you're more of a person who likes spicy seasoning, something like this. If you like it more of just salt and pepper, you can go with salt and pepper. But I'm not gonna go into which one is the best seasoning. You just select the seasoning that you like and then just run with it, all right? So, what you wanna do when you're seasoning a brisket like this, you wanna season this brisket, you wanna leave it overnight, at least 18 to 24 hours, so that the seasonings can actually, the rub can actually go in there and penetrate the meat. Okay, so what I like to do is I like to turn my brisket around when I'm just about to season it for the first time. I like to turn my brisket around where it's the fat cap. Now I know I've seen some people remove some of this fat cap, but honestly they recommend about 1/4 of an inch of a fat cap, and if you notice, this one is all meat. I mean, the fat cap starts right there. I really don't have to do too much work. This only happens if you do your work before you purchase it. If you purchase one that has a very, very thick fat cap, you are gonna have to go in there and, if you want to, remove some of the fat cap. Why? Because what this will end up happening is the fat cap is gonna actually prevent some of the seasonings to go in. Now, one of the things that I started doing as well is I started scoring the fat cap a couple of times, only because I want to be able to get some of my seasoning in here, because if I just leave it like that, the seasoning will not actually hit the meat, it'll hit just the fat. So all I do is I get a knife and I just kind of score it, a couple of lines, not too much. You don't want to get into the brisket too much, you just want to give it a little bit of a score, so that when you do put in your seasonings, it does actually hit in there. And primarily where you have your fat is where you want to do the scoring, because that's what's actually blocking the seasoning from going in there. So you don't have to do this. I just recently started doing this because I see it as a waste more than anything. If you're putting seasoning in the fat, unless you're going to end up eating the fat, you're not really going to use it. You're going to end up throwing it away. So just a couple of scores. Going across as well. Again, you don't want to hit the meat too much, because then you'll start cutting into the meat. Okay. Once you score that, then a generous application of your seasoning, whatever seasoning you end up deciding to use, is preferred. I am going to go ahead and do this. I like a very brisket that gives you a little bit of kick. So I use a lot of the seasoning on my briskets. Now, the ultimate compliment is when somebody comes and they taste your brisket for the first time, or they come in and they taste your brisket and you offer them barbecue sauce and they say, nah, no thanks, your brisket does not need barbecue sauce. That is the ultimate compliment that any smoker can get. Because what that's telling you is that the meat that you're providing to them, it tastes so good that you don't need any type of additional taste to make it taste better. Okay? So you want to get all the edges. Be generous with it. The last thing you want is to do all this work and then at the very end say, man, I wish I had a little bit more of a flavor to it. Alright, so the reason that I use a fat side first is because when I flip it over, I'm not going to move it anymore. I'm just going to leave it there, and that's it. That's how I'm going to let it marinate. So, why is that important? Because now that I have my actual meat that is exposed, now I can go to town on this and actually continue the seasoning process on this side. Don't be afraid to put extra seasoning on the sides. And you just want to be generous with it. You grab this side here, you pick it up. You grab this side over here, you pick this up. And you just cover it with as much as possible. Now, the more seasoning that you put in, if it's a spicy seasoning, the more seasoning you put in, the more spicy your brisket is going to come out. If you don't like it really spicy, but you do like a little bit of a spice, don't put too much. But what I like to put whenever I put on a brisket, if you notice, This brisket looked a little bit wet when I first started applying, and now it's starting to look dry, which means the seasoning is starting to go in there and absorb all the extra liquid that's on top of the brisket, which is good. All right, I think I'm happy with that. When you start seeing some of the dry rub stay dry, I think that's a good indicator that you've pretty much put in as much that it is going to take at this time. All right, next step is I'm going to show you is how to go ahead and prep this to put it in the refrigerator. You are going to need to rest it for 18 to 24 hours, and that'll be next. Now that you have your brisket ready to be to marinate for about a day, the next thing you want to do is whether you have it in a tray or something like this, you are going to need to rest it inside your refrigerator. Have to make space inside your refrigerator for about 18 to 24 hours. It depends on you. I think anything after 12 is fine, but the longer you let it sit, the better it is. Now, I do highly recommend you find yourself some type of heavy-duty, professional-grade aluminum foil. Because I'm in Texas and we do have HEB here in Texas, I found this aluminum foil that is really, really good. It is worth the extra $1 or $2 compared to Reynolds and all the other ones. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm actually going to cover the top part so that the majority of the smells stay within the brisket, within the packaging itself. So you measure and then you cut. And this is, again, I'm very impressed with this foil paper. So you measure, you cut, and then you tighten it as much as possible. Now with a regular foil paper, you have to be very careful because this thing will rip on you. But because this is a heavy duty foil paper, you can be a little bit more rough with it and it'll be okay. You want to cover it. Now this by no means will it prevent the smells of the seasonings to permeate outside of your actual encasing, but it will help a little bit. It will protect the meat from getting any other food particles in here while it is marinating. But once you have this done, you want to stick this into your refrigerator. And you want to go ahead and leave it there for at least 18 hours. I would even leave it up to 24, but I've gone as short as 12 hours when I forget to season it the night before. Okay, so the reason that I was trying to make this video, or I want to make this video, is because we are also going to do it Texas Crutch style. What does that mean? When you smoke a brisket, after a certain amount of time, your brisket will stop taking in smoke. There's some people that they like, once they get the bark that they like on the brisket, they want to stop the brisket from hardening anymore on the outside, creating that bark, but they still want it to cook and they want it to be juicy. That's when you start using the Texas Crutch. Now, a lot of the people, there's 3 ways to cook a brisket. Naked. Cooking a brisket naked means you leave it on there for the amount of time till it reaches your temperature without doing anything to it, and then you pull it out. The other way to cook it is, once you get the bark you want, you can use aluminum foil, which is considered wrapping it, and at that point, now it's considered cooking it Texas Crutch style. But the other option is called your butcher paper. Now, don't get any butcher paper. You need to get the butcher paper that's meant for barbecues. Again, not that I'm not that I go to HEB a lot, but HEB was the only one that I found here locally that had butcher paper that is meant for cooking. Now you can go to your craft section and buy butcher paper that has wax on one side and all that, but that's not what you want. That's not meant for smoking and that's not meant for meats. You need to buy the butcher paper that is meant for meats. Notice how it says unwaxed, unbleached butcher paper. So instead of wrapping my brisket with foil paper, I am going to end up using butcher paper. Why? There's a big difference between wrapping a brisket in foil and wrapping it in butcher paper. The main reason, the two things, or the one thing that they do have in common, is that once you wrap it, what's going to happen is that it will accelerate your cooking process, but it will also retain a lot of the moisture. It'll stop, the moisture will stop leaving the brisket, and it'll stay within the brisket because you have it wrapped. But the difference between foil paper and butcher paper is that butcher paper is more porous, which means you'll have the benefit of keeping the moisture, but you also have that benefit of that if you still have some smoke going in through your smoker, that smoke will still be able to penetrate the butcher paper and still get to your brisket, whereas if you use foil paper, it will not. Once you wrap it in foil paper, it's pretty much covered. At that point, you're essentially, what you're doing is you're wrapping it and you're saying, I don't want anything else other than the heat to come in. But with this one, you're saying, hey, I want the heat to come in, but I also want any of that smoke that still lingers to come on into the brisket. So that is what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be wrapping it with butcher paper when we cook it, in order for it to give us that additional smoke while it's still cooking. But for now, that is later. For now, all we're going to do is we're going to put this brisket into our refrigerator. I will see you guys tomorrow. Of course, in YouTube land is like in the next 2 or 3 seconds, but I will see you guys tomorrow when I'm ready to cook this brisket, and I'll show you how to set up your smoker and everything else so you can have the best brisket that you've ever had.